Hey Grauwelt fans, it's me again, Victor Salinas, with another tutorial video. I've actually been thinking about doing something like this for a really long time, and I'm really excited to finally just sit down and get it done. And I've been thinking a lot about languages. I'm a really big fan of linguistics. I can speak English, I think, fairly well, and the other language that I grew up speaking was Spanish at home from my parents. And I've always taken a really big interest in other languages. I know bits and pieces of like German, Japanese, Portuguese, and Italian are really easy because they're very close to Spanish. And I'm just always really fascinated by learning about languages, learning how to write bits and pieces. I really should sit down and devote more time to really learning something like a new language from beginning to end. But I think a lot of you will share that interest with me in learning new languages and linguistic skills. And this is something that I've talked to a lot of you about via email. And questions that I've gotten is, how do you make a fantasy language? How do you name, characters? I've done videos about that in the past. How do you name different places and things and kind of give a coherent sound and continuous sort of feel to the way that things are named and the word choices. So to continue on in that tradition, I've decided to make a small video series. I'm planning just 3 videos. It might be a little longer depending on the feedback that I get if there are any additional questions. But 3 videos on how to invent your own fantasy language. And this first one is just going to be the basic building blocks of language, what are called phonemes, which are the basic sounds, which we'll get into here in just a moment. But before we continue, I'd like to invite everyone to go to the Grauwelt website at grauwelt.com/free. I'll put the URL in the video description and also the video itself. If you sign up there, you'll get updates every time that we post something new, a new video, a new short story, a lot of contests and giveaways. We do something every month for all the subscribers. And also, you'll get a free preview of the first Grauwelt book, The Sword and Its Servant, and you get to see some of these principles in action in there, the different names and bits of language that are specially crafted to fit the setting. So you'll get to see some of these lessons in action if you get that free preview and read through that. So again, I'll put the URL in the video description and also the video itself. I invite everyone out there watching this to go visit. Just take a moment to put your email address there and press the button. You'll get all that stuff instantaneously. Now, getting back into our topic, going through these videos, we're going to concentrate on a language that I'm making up for the very first time when I'm doing these videos. I've made up a few languages before for different like role-playing games and campaigns and things that we've played, some other short stories that I've done. And now this one is going to be totally unique, and maybe I'll use it for something later, but I intend on just using it for this video series. And it's a language that I'm going to call Seidol. And that doesn't really have any special significance. I just like the sound of it. I was just toying around with some names for it, and I just settled on that one. It only took me like 30 seconds, I guess, to come up with it, and I think that sounds pretty good. And what I'm going to do is start with the basis of something in reality. This is something that I like to do for any creative project. I think the best place to start, as many of you that are familiar with some of my other videos will know, that I always start with some kind of historical or real-world significance, some kind of element within our real world, and use that as the basis point for my inspiration. So what I'm going to do with this language, Seidol, is base it kind of on Romance languages, so Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, French, Romanian, those sorts of things. So if any of you are familiar with those languages, you'll see some of those elements throughout all of these tutorials about this fantasy language. You'll see those elements come through in the sounds and the word choices, and definitely in the grammar that we'll get to later. So using a real-world language like this is going to give us a lot of shortcuts. It's really hard to make a language from scratch. The most famous person that ever did their own languages was J.R.R. Tolkien. And, he used inspiration from like Norse languages and a lot from Celtic. And even he didn't make everything up from the ground up. Because if you try to do that, I think you'll get too mechanical. And a lot of times, like I've fallen prey to this, is if you try to make up too much of it and not base it on something that's real, you'll end up getting something that's kind of robotic and looks derived, like it looks like it came from one person's mind rather than evolved from the ground up like languages really do. Because real-world languages evolve slowly over a long period of time through, thousands or millions of speakers So there's no one person, pulling the strings, making up the rules, making up what words are going to be used. It's the interactions of many millions and millions of people over a long span of time that make a language. So I think it's just easier to borrow something that already exists, that already has had that process, and just kind of modify it for your own purposes. And that's definitely what we're going to be doing in this case. So in this lesson, the very first thing that we're going to do, as I mentioned earlier, is decide on the phonemes. And this is going to become very important, especially in later videos, as we come up with the script or symbols and also the grammar. Phonemes are the sounds of a language, not necessarily the letters of a language, but the sounds that are possible, the range of different sounds that exist in a language. And starting with setting up the phonemes is going to help us by giving our language a feel. We're going to come up with a basis, a sort of dimension to our language, a boundary that we're going to set up, and it's going to give us a feel. Now, what I mean by that, if you've ever heard another language that you don't speak personally or you might know very little of, if you ever hear other people around you speak a language like that, you can usually tell what language it is, if not that, maybe what region of the world it comes from, just by the way it sounds. For example, last week, I heard some people speaking what I believe to be Russian. It was, if not Russian, another very similar Eastern European language. And, we pick up on that. The languages have a certain cadence, they have a certain sound, they have a certain range of different phonemes, that if you hear it, you can already tell, like, oh, well, that's Russian, that's Japanese, that's Swahili. And that's what we're going to do today, is just set up the very basic sounds of the language, and then as we go on through these lessons, we're going to use that basis to craft the rest of the language, including the script and the grammar. I'm not a linguist myself, but from what I understand about the evolution of language in human beings, that's really where it starts. We make the sounds start to stand for nouns, for verbs, for different objects and actions and feelings, and it's the sounds that really later establish the symbols if a society develops writing, and also the structure of things. So for our fictional language, Seidol, we're going to have 23 phonemes, and I'll put them up on the screen there that you can see, and then we'll go over individually kind of examples of how these work. And I try to make these as absolutely simple as possible. They're kind of in alphabetical order to the Roman alphabet that a lot of us use, but you'll notice that a lot of them are missing. Again, these are not necessarily letters. Of course, these are being represented by letters, but these are the sounds that are going to be possible in our language. For example, in English, we have the phoneme that's written th, like in the word that. It makes a th sound. And that phoneme in English is represented by two letters, but it makes one sound. So similarly, the letter H makes the h sound, and it's represented by just one letter. But the letters and phonemes are independent of each other. I know that can be a little confusing, but a letter is just a symbol that can really stand for anything, could even be silent. It's just used for spelling words. A phoneme is the sound, independent of any symbol. Now, I settled on these 23 phonemes again using Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese as the basis. A lot of these sounds exist in those three languages, and I just picked the ones. I dropped out a number of them. You'll notice that there aren't things like, there's no sound for V, there's no V sound, there's just a B. In Spanish, you don't pronounce V's at all. They're pronounced just like the letter B. There's also a discernment between two types of H's. There's a regular H, and there's also a double H, which I'll explain later, has a different sound. So there's kind of a blending here of those three languages, and I just picked the sounds, not necessarily willy-nilly, but I just picked them based on the way that I wanted the language to sound, again using Romance languages as the basis. And this language is going to have a very fluid sound. Again, I'm a native speaker of Spanish as well, but I've always been attracted to Portuguese. It's much more fluid. Spanish to me is kind of choppy, and that makes it easily pronounceable, I think. Portuguese kind of has a slurred, I don't want to say necessarily slurred, but it flows very easily. Sounds flow into each other very easily as compared to Spanish. So I kind of wanted to capture a little bit of that in this fictional language, Seidol. So getting into some examples, I'm going to go over an example of each one of these 23 phonemes in a word that I made up. This to me is always the most fun part, maybe tied with making up a script. That's always fun to make up the symbols. I doodle all the time, like the margins of paper. If I'm writing notes for a short story or something, I'll just like make up these symbols and things and probably not really do anything with them most of the time. They just sit in the notebook, but that's always fun to me. And it's also really fun to just make up words. And again, any of you that are somewhat familiar with Romance languages may see a couple of similarities between a word like in Spanish, Italian, or Portuguese and these words that I've made up. A couple of them I just made up altogether based on the phoneme sounds that we selected, but most of them were taken from a real word in one of those three languages, and then I just kind of transmuted it to fit the phonemes that we selected. So going in order of the 23 phonemes we selected, the first phoneme we have is A, as in the word ate, which means wing. The second one is B, like the letter B, is beiju, which means kiss. The third one is a sort of K sound, and we have care, which means face. Then we have the sort of D sound, which is denjo, finger. Next we have an E, which is shown in the word etal, which means paper. Then we have an F sound, which is represented in the word fantro, which means inside. Then we have a G sound. Now I want to say it's always going to be a hard G. So in this example we have gesha, which means house. It's never going to be jisha. Every time you see a G, it's going to be what's called a hard G, like in the word gate in English. It's never going to be like giant, where it makes a sort of J sound. It's always going to be a hard G. So it's gesha and not jisha. Then we have the first of two H sounds. This is going to be a sort of simple H, and we have hukino, which means knife. And then that's going to be contrasted with the next one, which is a hard H, like dacha, which means straw or hay in that case. So the kind of straw that you'd have like on the floor of a barn or that an animal would eat. And the reason I wanted to have these two is because in Old Spanish, there used to be a discernment with the letter X made a harder H sound, and then there was a J that made like a simpler H. And that's since been lost in Spanish, but I wanted to capture that in this language just because I thought it was really interesting. So when we see it written out in the Roman alphabet, it's going to be a double H. So you'll pronounce it like ch, a kind of like sound that you make maybe if you're disgusted by something. That's what you'll use. So whenever you see that double H, that's the sound that we're making, as opposed to a simple H, which is just represented by one H. Okay, the next letter we have is an I, which is represented in the word intena, which means native, someone or something that is native to a certain place. The next phoneme we have is a J sound, as represented in the word juye, which means gem. Moving on to the next phoneme, we have an L sound, like in the word losto, which means shine or shiny. Then we have an M sound, like in the word minda, which means look, like he, she, or it looks. The next sound we have is an N sound, like in the word neto, which means child. The next sound we have is an O, like in the word oltali, which means painting. Then we have a P sound, like in the word pescuina, which means follow, he, she, or it follows. Then we have an R sound. Now this R is going to be a trilled R, unlike in English that has what's called a uvular R. It's a little softer. This is like a Spanish R, not a rolling R, but just a hard trilled R. Rudri, or brick. Now this next one might be a little difficult for some that are not familiar with it. This is going to be a rolling R like in Spanish, and that will be represented in this lesson by the word eraja. That is to grab, he, she, or it grabs. Then we have an S, just like in English, it's represented in the word as, which means gold. Then we have an SH, again this is not the letters SH, but that sound, ash, which means this way or that way. Then we have a T, like in the word tam, which means take, he, she, or it takes. Then we have an U in the word ulsari, which means to borrow. And lastly, we have a j sound. Again, this is not the letter ZH, but that sound, jes, which means 10. So kind of like in the French word déjà vu, it's a zh sound. So those are the 23 phonemes and example words that I made up using those phonemes for this fictional language that we're going to come up with in this video series. Now, if you're familiar with Romance languages, you might be looking for some patterns here with quantity and also gender. I'm not going to put either one of those things in this fictional language to help keep things simple. I don't want to make this into a lecture about Romance languages. We're just kind of using real-world languages as a basis to kind of make up our own. So if you're looking for that pattern, it's not going to be there. We're not going to do genders and like pluralization rules like you would get in Romance languages. So hopefully thus far through these examples we've illustrated how to achieve a sort of internal consistency with the sounds of things. So the first thing that I always do when coming up with a fictional language is just start with the phonemes. So I think the easiest way to do that is base it on some real world language or group of languages, like in this case Romance languages, and just look at the phonemes that exist in those in real life, and you might drop some and add some others, but kind of have a basis like that, put a boundary around what sounds are possible in your language, and then make a list of all the possible phonemes in that language, and then from there you'll be able to move on to the next steps. So just start with the simplest thing first and then get more complex as necessary. I know a lot of people who have tried to do their own fantasy language, some writer friends or people working on RPGs that I've known, or even video games, trying to make up bits and pieces of like an alien language or something, always tried to do like the more complex things first. Like they try to come up with a script and do the grammar. And I always tell them, like, just start with basics. Start with the way that real languages actually evolve, and just start with the sounds themselves, and then just use those as the basic building blocks, because phonemes are the basic building blocks of all language. So just start with those and then build the more complex structures using those simpler pieces. Now, a couple notes about the pronunciation of these words. As you'll see, there are 5 vowels here, and the vowels are a, e, I, o, u, just like in the Romance languages. They're not like in the English vowels. And all the consonants are, I think, pretty self-explanatory, very similar to the way that they are in English, or more accurately, the way they are in Romance languages, especially with the trilled R and the rolling R. Those are of particular interest, I would say, to those not familiar with Romance languages. Now, you may have noticed in the example words that we have here in this video that the emphasis will always fall on the second to last syllable of a word. So, for example, the first word that we had there was ate, which means wing. The stress is on the second to last syllable. Now, this is a 2-syllable word, so it falls on the a part. It's ate, not ate. It's ate. And if we have a longer word like hukino, the second to last syllable is the ki part, so it's hukino. Hukino. You see, the emphasis is on the second to last syllable. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and any exception that we're going to find in these videos is going to be marked with an accent mark to let you know that that's where the emphasis falls. So, again, using that last word as an example, hukino, the stress falls on the second to last syllable, but then if we look at the word for native, imtena, you'll see that the I, the first syllable, is marked with an accent mark, and that will let you know that that's where the stress falls. So it's not imtena, it's imtena. We'll also come across a lot of diphthongs, as they're called, not as interesting or perhaps as sexy as that word may look at first. A diphthong is when multiple vowels come together, so you have to have what's called a strong vowel and a weak vowel together, and they make an entirely new sound. For example, the Seidol word for there is, kaita. Kaita, you'll see the A and I sound come together to make an I. It's not kaita, it's kaita. And that rule, that diphthong rule, can also again be broken by an accent mark, just like with the word pescuina. Pescuina. It's not pescuina, it's pescuina. You'll see that accent mark will break the normal rule again of a diphthong. In Seidol, we're going to have 15 possible diphthongs, and I'll list them there on the screen for all of you to see, along with an English word to kind of show you how that would be pronounced. So going through them, the first one is I, which is pronounced just like the English word I. Then we have ow, which is pronounced just like the English word ouch, the ow part of that word. Then we have a, which is pronounced like in the English word hey. Then we have ew, which I struggled to find an English word that was close enough to that. There's not really an ew. Like in Romance languages, Europa is Europe. In English, it's spelled that way, but we don't pronounce it that way. So the closest I come up to is maybe like hew, to hew a piece of wood. But it's not quite that way, so it's ew. I hope that's close enough to be able to be understood. Next we have ya, ye, like in the word yet, yi, like in the word year, yo, like in yo. Maybe you might say that to one of your friends, I don't know. And then we have you, just like in the English word you. Then we have oi, like in the English word boy, the oi part of that. And then lastly, we have the diphthongs that are formed with U. And U is just like W when combined with another vowel. And in fact, in Latin, there was not a W at all. They just used the U sound for that, and it does the same things. For example, we have wa, like in want, we, like in went, we, like in the word we, wo, like in the word work, and then woo, like in the word would. And you can see how those diphthongs will combine with each other to make entirely new sounds. So again, you had to have a weak vowel and a strong vowel. The strong vowels are usually considered a, e, and o, and the weak ones are e and u. And you'll see that there has to be a combination of either two weak vowels is okay, like in yi and wu, or a strong vowel and a weak vowel together. Because if you combine two strong vowels, like a double A would be a, or a double E would be e. They don't really, if you try to pronounce them, they don't really combine into a new sound. They maintain their sounds. That's why they're called strong. And the weak ones are able to lend their sounds to another vowel. So now that we understand the basic phoneme structure and the diphthongs and the emphasis, we're free to make up as many words as we like, which is really, again, my favorite part of all of this. I do have some notebooks with some other languages that I made up over the years, and I never really do anything with them. I just fill up notebooks with words and come up with little bits of grammar and never use any of them for anything, unfortunately. But that's always my favorite part, is just coming up with a really long vocabulary. And once you have the basic phoneme structure, you could just make up words. You don't need to come up with a vocabulary if you don't want. There is a lot of, for me, satisfaction in just making up a list of words and knowing them, just being able to see them and say, I made this. This sounds like it really is something that exists. And then, of course, if you wanted to use it for a creative project, you certainly could. Now, the primary rule for all languages over all time has always been whatever sounds best to the speaker's ears. And a lot of times in linguistics, a linguist will tell you there's not necessarily an explanation for why something sounds that way, why there's a certain rule of grammar, or why certain words have exceptions to the rule. It's really just because people like to hear it that way. They like to say it that way. We can think in our everyday lives, we like to use the sounds that we use, the words that we use, the phrases that we use, because we like using them. And we drop the ones that we don't like to use. I mean, we do that with word choice. We do that with the way that we pronounce things. And that's really how languages evolve. There's not always a rhyme or reason. Of course, every language has an internal logic that is its grammar. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, the reason why things are the way that they are is just favoritism. Certain people like certain sounds, and that's the way that they get to be that way, is the repetition. You hear someone pronounce something in a new way and you like it, so you emulate it, and then someone else hears it and it just keeps going and going and going. So I hope that this first lesson, as brief as it is, helps kind of open up the avenue about how you can make up your own language, even if it's just to pass the time. Maybe you're bored someday and you just want something to do. Spend a few hours making up your own language. And I think toying around with these ideas will give you an appreciation for real-world language, and that's something that's always come in handy to me, again, as another point of inspiration in my own work. Just understanding the way that the real world works in every facet, even in linguistics, is a way to get into other people's minds and borrow their ideas. So if you have a passion for linguistics, you get to get in the head of millions of people over many millennia and understand in some small way exactly how and why their culture evolved the way that it is. You get a new appreciation for humanity in a different light that maybe you didn't see before. And that's going to serve as kind of a wellspring for new ideas that you would have never have thought of or come across anyway else. So I'll wrap this video up by again inviting everyone to visit the Grauwelt website at grauwelt.com/free. Just takes a couple of seconds to pop in your email address there and hit the button. You'll get all the email notifications for contests and giveaways that we do, as well as short stories and other content. And then you'll also be instantaneously mailed a preview of the first Grauwelt book, The Sword and Its Servant, which you'll get to see a lot of these naming conventions, these same concepts that we're going over in these videos at work in the story that you'll get for free. So I'll put that URL in the video itself and also in the video description, so I'd invite everyone to check that out. It just takes a couple of seconds. And on the next video, we're going to delve into making up scripts and symbols for this fantasy language Seidol. We're going to make up a kind of alphabet, and I'll go over exactly how I make up symbols and how they can look legitimate and not just scribbled or kind of phony. So I have some pretty cool ideas, I think. And again, it will fit the phonemes that we came up with in this video, and also kind of keep a sort of theme that makes it feel that's really important with languages. It's not logical. There's a sort of feeling, and it's kind of more art than science when it really comes down to it. So I'd also like to ask everyone watching this video to kind of invent your own word in Seidol. So use these phonemes that we made up in this video to make up your own word using that and make it fit into this language. I'd like you to leave that in a comment along with the definition of the word. And I'll do that in this video too as an example to show you what I mean. And maybe we together can come up with like a dictionary of words and actually make this. That'd be pretty cool if we could actually make this into a language that we subscribers on this channel knew and no one else did. That might be reaching kind of far, but I think that would be pretty cool. At the very least, I'd like to see you guys put this into practice and see what kind of cool words we can make up using these phonemes that we came up with today. And don't forget to rate and share this video if you liked it, and subscribe to the Grauwelt channel. Konuj banal a jimabal.